Tell with the books that have had a big influence on us in life, and these books are carefully selected from our Fortean arsenal, and they're more than just paper and ink. They are keys to wonder, mystery, and continuous learning. The books that acted as a parachute and opened our minds and left a lasting impression on us. And my book this week is The Dark Side of Christian History by Helen Ellaby. And it's about the deep impact the Christian church had on all aspects of society from 100 CE all the way up to the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, and then up to the present day. And from medicine, technology, science, education, history, art, and commerce, the church's influence created a significant societal collapse and a loss of major defining elements of civilization. And the book goes into the consequences of the church taking over leadership in most areas and in people's thinking. A big one they infiltrated was medicine, and during the Dark Ages, Greek medical practices were declared heretical by the church, which led to dangerous medical practices such as bleeding out. And monks believed in the curative powers of bleeding to prevent toxic imbalances and control sexual desire, which contributed to countless deaths by the 16th century. And the church's teachings also forbade anything to do with the flesh, and they discouraged hygiene practices. And this eventually led to the disappearance of toilets and plumbing and the rise of disease. The book then goes into the devastating impact of epidemics on towns and villages during these centuries, and about the neglect of the once extensive network of roads that hindered transportation and communication until the 19th century. And Ellaby looks at the devastating impact of book burnings, which were orchestrated by religious authorities. And these events set civilization back millennia, and the destruction of ancient texts and the suppression of knowledge not only erased the intellectual achievements of past civilizations, but it also hindered the evolution of human understanding. And St. Augustine denied there were any inhabitants on the opposite side of the earth because they were never mentioned in scripture about the descendants of Adam. And this was the kind of thinking that was pushed as rational. And there were also the destruction of the Library of Alexandria in 391, and that highlights the extent of the setbacks and the closure of ancient academies and the restriction of education to the clergy further suffocated intellectual growth during the Dark Ages, after Christians spent years destroying books and libraries. And the book exposes the Christian Inquisition as a tool of terror, with inquisitors openly admitting its purpose to instill fear and achieve public obedience rather than saving the souls of the accused. And the destruction of philosophical and literary works from the ancient world was a deliberate effort to erase the traces of pre-Christian knowledge, leaving behind only Christian theology, devotion, and books. And then we've got the Reformation, which is another period, and the book covers the tensions and conflicts that arose during this era, revealing how religious differences fueled animosity and further divided communities. And she writes about the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages and how those periods, often perceived as regressive, were marked by the suffocating influence of religious dogma, which further stopped the free exchange of ideas and stifled progress. And this book also talks about historical events, exposing things like the witch hunts and the alienation of nature, with the church using tyranny and fear as a weapon of control, and they deemed anything of the physical world as devil worship, which led to the torture and execution of those who dared defy them under the vague accusation of heresy. During the Middle Ages, it became a systematic policing and terrorization of society. But like all tyrants, eventually they started to turn on themselves when during the Reformation, Christians began to slaughter each other. And reading these accounts, you can't help but draw some parallels between the church's attitudes of yesteryear and the present day. challenges of certain types of people who grapple with nuances and discernment. The tendency to label those who think differently as devil worshippers is still prevalent, and it mirrors as a historical pattern that this book is all about. And prominently on the cover, it says that this book is a must read for all, and that proclamation is no exaggeration. And you'll go through a number of emotions reading this book: disbelief, shock, anger, and it may even bring on some distant past life memories. It is an expose of Christian history and the death and devastation that it's left behind.
Yeah, Western civilization was held back about 1,000 years by Christianity. It's good when I don't like thinking about it too much because it makes me angry. Because one of my navel gazing things is to look and think about, like, what would we have gotten sooner or what we would have lost. I mean, the Romans in the late Iron Age, just before the Christians came along, were already building steam engines. They were using them they'd figured out that this pressure steam could be used to turn cranks and pins and cams, but they also had railways. The wagons were pushed by horses or, men. All they had to do was the obvious idea of putting the steam engine on the train, and they would have had the steam locomotive and the steam train, 1,800 years before Robert Stevenson? Just think about that. Nearly 2,000 years. And that's just the only thing is in Catherine Nixie's The Darkening Age, one of the reasons that the Elgin marbles survived on the Parthenon is the Christians didn't know how to build scaffolding. Now, I think because they chased all the engineers out of Greece and Rome as being heretics and builders of idols and, this kind of icons. And there was lots of things like that. The most tragic one was the abandonment of sanitation systems. This is why so many people in the Middle Ages went back to live in the countryside, because the cities and towns were filthy. Where the Romans, and it wasn't just the Romans, the other barbarian tribes of Europe had made tremendous advances in technology as well in their own world. And even before the Etruscans, my God, and even before that, were doing stuff that was incredible. And here we have, it's all gone. And we have the Black Death, compounded by the fact that the church declares cats to be evil and emissaries of the devil, so they couldn't hunt the rats. And that they killed the dogs as well. They believed that they were all devil things because it's in the Bible. And lots of things like that. And, there's, I'm trying to think of, there's so many examples I can think of. Yeah, during the Dark Ages, it was, who was the one group that had tremendous technological advances? The Vikings, the pagans. They built the most incredible ships. They explored the world, and they had incredible technology and metallurgy, and they were also excellent farmers as well. And they were pagans. And the Carthaginian Empire under Charlemagne and the Pope killed them and the Saxons, another pagan tribe. And it just goes on and on and on. And even, by the time we had the Protestants enlightened, well, we really started to get back again on our feet with the Renaissance. What was that? The Renaissance of the pagan classical world. And even the church wanted to build grand basilicas, like and great sculptures, and that's why they called upon the likes of the Medicis, who were probably quite secular, understood that the church was actually holding, the world back, and that's why they hired people like Brunelleschi to complete the dome of the church in Florence, which was a staggering technological achievement for its time. And Brunelleschi also was one of the artists who developed perspective. And when they were given a chance to not be bullied by the church during the Renaissance, you had the stratospheric rise in technology and arts, philosophy, engineering, and architecture. But there was another aspect to it. A lot of stuff went underground because if you look at how they built the cathedrals of the Middle Ages, and some of them are staggering. That was because the Freemasons held a lot of that stuff in secrecy. How to use flying buttresses, how to build load-bearing walls, load-bearing arches. These were all classic Roman techniques and Greek techniques, and the Freemasons instinctively knew about this. And it may have been the lodge that was the secretive lodge at Roslin in Scotland, where they were probably first, organized to build these churches. The Sinclairs seem to have they had a building there with all the best stonemasons from, and somehow they had access to the ancient engineering that allowed them to build. It's almost like Roslin Chapel was a test for all the different styles of architecture in it. It was a test before they hit building the main cathedrals. It's just amazing. I don't like dwelling on it too much because the church says things like, "Well, didn't the church sponsor the Renaissance? We would never hear about Michelangelo and Brunelleschi and all the rest." Well, that's why that's because they wanted the technology. They realized they weren't going to build their St. Peter's Basilica and all these other kind of vast monuments without getting that knowledge back. So they had to capitulate and allow artists and engineers and scientists to rule the roost again. But yeah, it's absolute catastrophe. Things like the medical stuff alone, the level of medical care in Rome and Greece was phenomenal. And it took up until probably the 1700s to get back to that level. We were robbed of the Western civilization, and particularly Europe, was catastrophically damaged by Christianity's arrival here from the Middle East.
You read that, you will be it's very frustrating, and it makes you very angry. It really does. And you shake your head and you have to read some of it twice because you can't believe what you've read. There's even, things in there that I wasn't aware of. Just little things as well, like the church's attitude to women was that they tempt man, so therefore they're harlots, but because they spend their time nurturing and looking after the home, then they're too focused on earthly things, therefore they must be devil worshippers. To gaslighting.
The Irish Catholic bishops sent a letter to the government in the 1940s saying that they have to ban Tampax and tampons because they're used to enhance sexual stimulation and have nothing to do with hygiene. The government ignored them, of course, thankfully, but this is what they were like even in the 1940s.
Yeah, unbelievable. If he was accused of heresy back then in the Middle Ages, and you were sentenced to death, your children could be as well, just for being related to you.
Yeah, and don't have this thing that was all the Vatican. Protestants were just as bad. It was Catholics and Protestants they were both equally as bad in what they got up to and persecuted. So don't have this thing that was all the Catholic Church in the Vatican. At least they tolerated the Renaissance enough that happened. And the Protestants gave us the Enlightenment and the Protestant Enlightenment later on. But the Calvinists and the Lutherans were worse than the Jesuits in the Inquisition. So it's like, don't limit it to one denomination.
Alienation from nature. Christianity has distanced humanity from nature. As people came to perceive God as a singular supremacy detached from the physical world, they lost their reverence for nature. In Christian eyes, the physical world became the realm of the devil. A society that had once celebrated nature through seasonal festivals began to commemorate biblical events bearing no connection to the earth. Holidays lost much of their celebratory spirit and took on a tone of penance and sorrow. Time, once thought to be cyclical, like the seasons, was now perceived to be linear. In the rejection of the cyclical nature of life, Orthodox Christians came to focus more upon death than upon life. Earthliness is synonymous with sinfulness throughout much of the Bible. For example, Colossians states, "Put to death therefore what is earthly in you, immorality, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming." A similar message is also found in James. This bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts is not such as comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, and devilish. Paul describes enemies of the cross of Christ as people whose God is their belly, who mind earthly things. The message is clear: the earth is ungodly. The Bible suggests that it was God Himself who ordained the antagonism between humanity and nature. God punishes Adam from having eaten from the forbidden tree of knowledge. In sharp contrast to earlier traditions, in which harmony with nature was a sign of godliness, Orthodox Christians understood God to have ordered that the earth become alien and hostile. Nature was instead seen as the realm of the devil. The Church chose the image of Pan, the Greek god of nature, to portray the devil. The horned, hoofed, and goat-legged man had been associated with a number of fertility figures and had previously been deemed essential to rural well-being. With Pan's guidance, all the mythical creatures of earth were thought to work in harmony: fairies, elves, and devas. Pan's skill on the panpipes was believed to fill the woods and pastures with enchanted music. His name, Pan, meant all and bread. But particularly after the turn of the millennium, when the Church authorized specific portrayals of the devil, the vilified Pan came to evoke terror or panic as the image of Satan. The perceived separation of nature from God affected the treatment of animals. The canonized 13th century scholar Thomas Aquinas declared that animals have no afterlife, have no inherent rights, and that by a most just ordinance of the Creator, both their life and their death are subject to our use. Animals were often thought to be agents of the devil. In his 1991 book, Replenish the Earth, Louis Regenstein writes that in the 10 centuries preceding the present one, there are accounts of the trials, torture, and execution, often by hanging, of hundreds of animals, mainly by ecclesiastical courts, acting under the assumption that animals can be used by the devil to do his work. The Inquisition spread the frightening belief in werewolves, and in 1484, Pope Innocent VIII officially ordered pet cats to be burned together with witches, a practice which continued throughout the centuries of witch hunting. The belief that animals were agents of the devil contributed to the breakdown in the natural control of rodents. The stupidity of that. Zealous Christians most frequently targeted cats, wolves, snakes, foxes, chickens, and white cocks as animals to be eliminated. Since many of these animals helped control the population of crop-eating and plague-carrying rodents, their elimination intensified outbreaks of plague. To make matters worse, church-licensed physicians ordered cats and dogs to be killed during times of plague, thinking that this would halt infection. Quite the reverse, of course, was true. The Church spent centuries prohibiting displays of reverence that involved nature. Worship should take place indoors, away from the natural elements. Christians destroyed outdoor temples and built churches with roofs in their stead. The Church condemned the veneration of trees and springs, where people would place candles or decorations. The 6th century bishop Martin of Braga asked, "What is the lighting of wax lights at rocks or trees or wells or crossroads, if it is not worship of the devil?" You can truly say religion, fanatic belief makes you stupid. The general capitularies of Charlemagne in 789 decreed, with regard to trees and rocks and springs, wherever ignorant people put lights or make other observances, we give notice to everyone that this is a most evil practice. What? Accessible to God, and wherever they are found, they are to be taken away and destroyed. Stories attempted to illustrate that the elemental power of trees, groves, and nature had submitted to Christ. This is so sickening. The 5th century Saint Martin of Tours is said to have stood under a revered pine tree as he ordered the tree to be cut down. As the tree was falling on him, he made the sign of the cross, and the tree raised itself up again and fell away from him. Yeah, okay. whatever. A similar story involves the 8th century missionary Saint Boniface in Hesse. As he chopped at a sacred oak tree, the trunk of the tree is said to have burst into 4 equal parts and landed in the shape of the— oh, come on! Just imposing religion onto nature, yeah? Inventing stories. And the 12th century manuscript portrays a scene in which a blind woman is taking an axe to a tree, despite the presence of the tree spirits which rise up aghast. A bishop stands beside her, blessing her action. Fuck you. Instead of suffering any dire consequences, the woman has her sight restored. Yeah. And people who believe this, they treat nature like shit after that. Because they have the blessing, yeah? According to such stories, the supernatural power of the earth has submitted to that of the celestial Christian God. Yeah, fuck you. No way. But until the Reformation and the witch hunts, most people did not believe this, yeah, because they had still the connection to Mother Nature. Unable to convince people of the absence of God in nature, the early church instead incorporated aspects. Notice the word incorporated, embodied. Aspects of the very nature worship it condemned, much in the same way that it developed ecclesiastical magic when it could not eliminate pagan magic. Images of archetypal fertility figures, usually male, sometimes horned, sometimes covered in foliage and disgorging vegetation, found their way into Christian iconography and manuscript illumination. Leaves became a frequent motif in Christian art. Trees, which had traditionally been venerated, often appeared in churchyards, and church columns were sculpted to simulate these trunks and perhaps even the mythical tree of life. In this attempt to assimilate people who still revered the divinity manifest in nature, the Church incorporated the very imagery that the Orthodox insisted was tied to the devil. Holidays. The Church also incorporated annual pagan festivals and holidays, claiming them as Christian. People used to mark seasons with celebrations and rituals that integrated their activity with the Earth's cycles. The Church placed Christian holidays to coincide with these older festivals in hopes of winning easier acceptance and recognition for its new religion. While the traditional meaning of most of these holidays had nothing to do with Orthodox Christianity, the Church usually tolerated the older rituals as it tried to teach a new biblical meaning. It was only during the Reformation that Orthodox Christians insisted that the older nature-oriented significance of holidays be abolished. The cycle of the year, at both the change of the 4 seasons as well as the height of each season, used to hold great importance. The winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, was a time of new birth. Often it was symbolized by the birth of an annual male fertility figure, a representation of the year's new sun. The height of the winter, midway between the winter solstice and spring equinox, was a time to nurture the new life. Spring was about encouraging fertility, when the sun and earth would unite to later bring forth the abundance of the harvest and the bounty of the hunt. From the summer solstice through autumn, the sun's energy transferred to the crops. The height of summer and the fall equinox were celebrations of the year's harvest and bounty. The end of the year, when fields lay dormant and the earth seemed to die at the height of autumn, was a time to honor the dead and release the past. By adopting these festivals as Christian, the early church sought both to win the allegiance of the populace as well as to harness the vitality of such festivals. While there is nothing to indicate the actual time of Jesus' birth, such an event most easily correlated to winter solstice festivals. The Roman celebration of the birth of the sun god Mithra, for instance, had also been observed on December 25th. In pre-Christian Egypt and Syria, a winter solstice ritual involved participants who would withdraw into the inner womb-like sanctuary of shrines until midnight, at which time they would come forth trumpeting, "The Virgin has brought forth, the light is waxing." Admonitions against celebrating such a holiday by Tertullian, Saint Augustine, and Pope Leo I notwithstanding, the Church adopted the winter solstice as Christmas. The birth of God's Son at the solstice easily correlated to the birth of God's Son. An Egyptian winter solstice celebration of the birth of Osiris, the divine representation of masculine fertility, on January 6 became the Christian Epiphany. The Church declared that it signified the manifestation of Jesus' divinity. Yet the spirit of both Christmas and the Christian Epiphany embodied the timeless celebrations of the winter solstice. The difference between them was due more to a difference in calendars than a difference in meaning. The Egyptian calendar was 12 days behind the Julian calendar. The dates of many current holidays do not fall exactly on the solstice, equinox, or height of season for a similar reason. Means of tracking time varied tremendously. Our present calendar was not completely adopted in England until 1751, in Russia until 1919, or in China until 1949. Festivals to mark the height of winter also found their way into Christianity, whether celebrated on the 2nd or 14th of February, celebrations in honor of feminine faces of divinity such as Bridget and Venus, who encouraged art, poetry, healing, fire, and wisdom, became the Christian Candlemas. Over time, however, the holiday lost the meaning of nourishing creativity and inspiration, and instead commemorated the end of Mary's 40-day period of purification after having given birth. The Church adopted spring equinox celebrations as Easter, as this time had already been one of celebrating the Son's resurrection and return to prominence. Celebrating the resurrection of the Son of God required no great change in understanding. In fact, the Easter celebrations were so similar to earlier celebrations, particularly those which recognized the resurrection of the Babylonian Adonais, the Greek Apollo, and the Roman Aptis, that a bitter controversy arose with pagans claiming that the Christian Easter celebration was a spurious imitation of the ancient traditions. Vernal equinox bonfires, originally prohibited by the Church, found their way as Easter fires into the official liturgy of Rome by the 9th century. Fertility symbols associated with spring, such as the egg and the incredibly prolific rabbit, survived as well. Yet, as Christianity spread, festivals of spring and summer gradually lost their original meaning. The height of spring became Pentecost or Whitsunday, an observance not of fertility but of the biblical event when people spoke in tongues, and a commemoration of the birth of the Church. The summer solstice no longer was to recognize the culmination of the sun's light, but rather was to honor Saint John, who had baptized Christ. Celebrations of the summer season became holidays for the Virgin Mary, such as Our Lady's Herb Day and Assumption Day, the day when Mary was assumed into heaven. Fall equinox celebrations were incorporated as Michaelmas, the feast of the Archangel Michael, the conqueror of Satan, and the Nativity of Mary. Gratitude for the harvest and the blessing of the year's medicinal herbs of nearby mountains or of the ocean remained part of these autumn holidays. To this day, shrines of Mary covered in ears of corn resembling the older pagan figures of grain can be found in autumn. The height of fall, the end of the Earth's annual cycle, was believed to be a time when the veil that separates the world of the living from the world of the dead becomes very thin. Despite Church attempts to prevent the celebration of this holiday, by the 9th century the feast of All Saints' Day had been moved to November 1st, and by 1045 the monasteries of Cluny had begun to observe the time as a day of all the departed ones. The earlier nature-oriented significance of the season survived, more fully, however, in the secular celebration of Halloween. Pagans also observed the cycles of the moon. Often these festivals involved veneration for feminine facets of God. Christian theologians condemned celebrations observing the cycles of the moon, called La Luna, as madness or lunacy, while St. Augustine denounced women's dances in honor of the new moon as impudent and filthy. When the Church could not hold such celebrations, however, it again incorporated them into the Christian calendar, usually under the guise of honoring Mary. The Church formally recognized the following: the day when Saint Anne conceived Mary, December 8, the day Mary was born, September 8, the day Jesus' conception was announced to Mary, also called the Annunciation, March 25th, the day Mary was purified from having given birth, February 2nd or 14th, and the day Mary was assumed into heaven, or the Assumption, August 15th. Unofficial celebrations of Mary were even more numerous. Celebration. While adopting nature-oriented festivals helped garner membership for the early church, the celebratory spirit of these festivals conflicted with the asceticism and solemnity of the Orthodox. As 16th century Guillaume Brigonnet warned, holidays are not for the pleasure of the body, but for the salvation of the soul, not for laughter and frolic, but for weeping. With the Reformation, both Protestant and Catholic churches attempted to abolish not only the nature-oriented practices of festivals, but also the joyful spirit that accompanied them. Holidays were now to be strict commemoration of biblical events that had no connection to the earth's season. The Church identified pagan practices as those which displayed either enjoyment or a connection with nature. There you go. Reverence for nature was so closely linked with expressions of joy that St. Augustine thought that the word jubilation derived from jubilus, the song hummed by those tending vines and olives.
If you want your dream to be, take your time, go slow. Do few things, but do them well. Heartfelt work goes purely. If you want to live like take your time, go slow. Your time goes do few things, but do them well. Heartfelt work grows pure. Day by day, stone by stone, build your secrets slowly. Day by day, you'll grow too, you'll know heaven's glory. If you want your dream to be, take your time, go take your day, go slowly, though time goes slowly, do you think fast through and round, 'cause the joys of holding,
This movie, Brother Sun, Sister Moon, it's one of the few Christian-themed movies I really love, because this is how it should be. So Saint Francis comes back from the war and is traumatized, and he goes through a phase of healing, and it changes him totally, and suddenly he is in a very different perception. Suddenly he goes after the birds on the roof. He sits in nature under a tree, doing nothing. And before that, before he went to war, he was this women hunting gigolo, basically, his father's pride. And then he is so changed. And then St. Clare's comes to him and says if she could sit with him, or if she should go away. And, well, she tells him that actually before he went to war he seemed crazy, so to speak, not in his right mind, but that now he is in his right state of mind. Literally, I guess, because he admires all things, all beings in nature, flowers, animals. And that's the way it should be. And this was so lost, the connection with nature, because of this insane ideology of the church. So, let's go on. The 9th century Synod of Rome reported that many people, mostly women, come to church on Saturdays and holy days, not to attend the Mass, but to dance, sing broad songs, and do other such pagan things. Yeah, pagan just being so derogatory, how they label it as less than and bad. The Catechisme de Meaux describes pagan practices: dancing round the fire, playing, holding feasts, singing vulgar songs, throwing grasses over the fire, gathering grasses before midnight or before breakfast, wearing grasses, keeping them for the whole year, keeping brands or cinders from the fire, and the like. Dancing was particularly offensive to Orthodox Christians. In the 6th and 7th centuries, ecclesiastical dancing was prohibited as being too sensual and too much enjoyed by women. Inquisitors claimed that both women and devil worshippers danced. Gosh. Dancing was a sign of spiritual decay to New England's Puritan ministers, who in 1684 published a pamphlet entitled An Arrow Against Profane and Promiscuous Dancing, drawn out of the quiver of the Scriptures. You can only shake your head. An 18th century missionary hymn warns that Satan slithers through the flesh of dancing men and dames to hold them in the mesh of his hot and amorous flames. Certainly not all Christians agreed with the Orthodox. In the Acts of John, for instance, Jesus danced and said, "To the universe belongs the dancer. He who does not dance does not know what happens. Now if you follow my dance, see yourself in me." To the Orthodox, neither nature nor physical pleasure were imbued with God's presence. Both were of the devil, of course. The Church had long condemned sensual pleasure as ungodly, as the 12th century Bishop of Chartres, Sir John of Salisbury, declared. Who except one bereft of sense would approve sensual pleasure itself, which is illicit, wallows in filthiness, is something that men censure and that God without doubt condemns. Holidays had involved such gaiety and pleasure that the Bishop of Autun wrote in 1657, "It is not appropriate to multiply holidays of obligation for fear of multiplying the occasions of sin." With the Reformation came the demand to curtail or abolish the celebratory and nature-oriented character of holidays. Laughter and revelry were seen as inappropriate for Christians, engaged in daily combat with Satan. Orthodox Christians wanted to ban maypoles and Sunday dancing, bagpipes and fiddles, accompanying bridal couples to church, the throwing of corn, and the distribution of dolls to the poor as superstitious and heathenical, wielding celebrations according to New England magistrates and ministers should not result in riotous or immodest irregularities. A law in 1639 prohibited the custom of drinking toasts or health drinking as an abominable pagan practice. One should not adjourn to the tavern after meetings and nature-oriented occasions such as harvest huskings should not degenerate into merrymaking occasions. In 1647, the English Parliament ordered that Christmas, along with other pagan holidays, should cease to be observed. The 1652 Parliamentary Act repeated that no observance shall be had on the 25th of December, commonly called Christmas Day, nor any solemnity used or exercised in churches in respect thereof. market was to be kept and stores were to remain open on Christmas Day. In New England, where celebrating Christmas was considered a criminal offense and remained forbidden until the second half of the 19th century, a person caught celebrating Christmas was liable to end up at the stocks or the whipping post. Factory owners changed starting hours to 5 a.m. on Christmas Day and threatened termination for those who were tardy. As late as 1870 in Boston, students who failed to attend public schools on Christmas were punished by public dismissal. Practices involving nature at holidays were curtailed. Orthodox Christians ceased church processions around towns and fields, which were intended to bless crops, to ask for a change in weather, or to appeal for protection against insects. They suppressed the practice of collecting branches, foliage, and flowers to be taken back to the church. The 1683 addendum to the Constitution of the Diocese of Annecy read, "We order the people under pain of excommunication to suppress and abolish entirely the torches and fires customarily lit on the first Sunday of Lent, and the masquerades, which are merely shameful relics of paganism." Efforts to abolish paganism centered upon doing away with reverence and enjoyment of both nature and feminine energy. Not surprisingly, the imagery used in reference to nature often had strong sexual overtones. Francis Bacon, whose aim was to endeavor to establish the power and dominion of the human race itself over the universe, frequently used such imagery. In his book, The Rebirth of Nature, Rupert Sheldrake writes, "Using metaphors derived from contemporary techniques of interrogation and torture of witches, Francis Bacon proclaimed that nature exhibits herself more clearly under the trials and vexations of art, mechanical devices, than when left to herself. In the Inquisition of Truth, nature's secret holes and corners were to be entered and penetrated. Nature was to be bound into service, and made a slave and put in constraint. Yeah, that's why we are in this mess, destroying the environment, polluting, mining, chopping down trees. She would be dissected, and by the mechanical arts and the hand of man she could be forced out of her natural state and squeezed and molded. Yeah, that will never work. So that human knowledge and human power meet as one. Humans are so stupid. So stupid. That's the arrogance of the egoic, selfish, entitled fanaticism makes you so stupid and so misguided. Nature was to be conquered, not enjoyed, and certainly not revered. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, they have done a lot of harm because of that shit here. A grim cheerlessness came to distinguish Christians. Already in the 12th century, the abbot Rupert of Deutz, I don't know if this is a German name, tried to defend the somberness of a Christian holiday. It is not a fast to make us sad or darken our hearts, but it rather brightens the solemnity of the Holy Spirit's arrival. For the sweetness of the Spirit of God makes the faithful loathe the pleasures of earthly food. By the 18th century, boring and pious were thought to be synonymous. In 1746, Diderot described the extremes of Christian unhappiness. For sure. Maybe that's where depression comes from. What cries, what shrieks, what groans, who has imprisoned all these woeful corpses? What crimes have all these wretches committed? Some are beating their breasts with stones. Others are tearing bodies with hooks off, or beating their breasts with iron. Remorse, pain, and death lurk in their eyes. As one man commented during the Reformation, it was never merry England since we were impressed to come to the church. Time. Christians encouraged a new concept of time that similarly had no connection to nature's cycles. Up until the Reformation, most people understood time to be cyclical. Reformational Christians, however, adopted St. Augustine's idea of linear time. Another fuck-up. Augustine described the pagan theory of cycles, circuits temporum, as those argumentations whereby the infidel seeks to undermine our simple faith, dragging us from the straight road and compelling us to walk with him on the wheel. Like the theory of reincarnation, the idea of cyclical time denied the uniqueness and finality of Jesus Christ. If time spirals around, providing repeated opportunities to grow and change, then the spirit of Jesus' life and resurrection could theoretically be experienced by anyone at any time, regardless of apostolic succession or hierarchical rank. Moreover, if time is cyclical, life might not consist of just one frightening chance to repent, or else to be forever damned, but rather of unlimited opportunities to develop a closer relationship with God. Controlling people is more difficult when they believe that there are many means and opportunities to return to God other than simply the one that the Church offers. Reformational Christians disparaged the beliefs and practices associated with the concept of cyclical time. They opposed the belief in lucky and unlucky days, such as that it was unlucky to marry during a waning moon, or that a sin committed on a holy day was worse than one committed at another time. Time should move evenly in a straight line without the disruptions and irregularity of changing seasons. 6 working days should always be followed by a Sabbath resting day throughout the year, as one Puritan character in a contemporary satire declares. It was passing folly to think one day more than another holy. The pendulum clock was invented in 1657 as a testimony to the belief that minutes were uniform in duration. By 1714, the new concept of even linear time had become familiar enough for a man to write in reference to the belief in lucky and unlucky days that some weak and ignorant persons may perhaps regard such things, but men of understanding despise them. As with so many elements of Orthodox Christianity, the concept of linear time was adopted by common people only after the Reformation. Death. Orthodox Christians repudiated the cyclical nature of physical life as well. Passages in the New Testament exhibit disdain for the cycle of life. Then, when lust has conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. By fostering an alienation from sex, birth, and the physical body, Orthodox Christians came to focus most intently upon death, not only as a tool to evoke fear, but also as an end in itself. Christian theologians understood sex at best to be permissible if engaged in solely for purpose of procreation, at worst to be a mortal sin. Yet they also believed that the birthing of a child was an ungodly act. The Church, with its licensed physicians, spurned the field of midwifery. Unfortunately, a woman who died in labor or in childbed was sometimes refused a Christian burial. Purifying or churching a woman for 40 to 80 days after she gave birth was deemed essential if she was to be readmitted into the church and proper Christian society. Even the Virgin Mary, in some people's eyes, needed to be purified after having brought Jesus into the world. Orthodox Christianity encouraged an alienation from the physical body itself. God's presence, it was believed, was not to be found in the physical world. Paul wrote in Corinthians, "Therefore we are always confident, knowing that whilst we are at home in the body, we are absent from the Lord." The Bible affirms that meaningful spiritual life is found only when one is detached from the physical body. The opposite is true. For if ye live after the flesh, ye shall die, but if ye through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, ye shall live. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Physical life is equated with sin and spiritual decay, while physical death is a repudiation of physical well-being, is thought to bring spiritual life. A disregard for the well-being of the physical body characterized Orthodox Christian behavior from the fall of the Roman Empire, when aqueduct systems, bathing houses, and hygiene were held in contempt and neglected. Protestants and Reformed Catholics attempted to outdo one another in their negligence of bodily hygiene. Oh my God, the stench must have been horrific. As the Augustinian priest and chaplain to the King of Poland declared, "Follow our Lord's example and hate your body. If you love it, strive to lose it, says Holy Scripture. In order to save it, if you wish to make peace with it, always go armed, always wage war against it. Treat it like a slave, or soon you yourself shall be its unhappy slave." In the Christian world, the very word carnal, which means simply of or relating to the body, took on the meaning of sin, immorality. Orthodox Christians also often contended that death was not a natural part of life, but rather was a punishment. Saint Augustine argued that death existed only as a punishment for sin. Wherefore we must say that the first men were indeed so created that if they had not sinned, they would not have experienced any kind of death, but that having become sinners, they were so punished with death that whatsoever sprang from their stock should also be punished with the same death. And therefore it is agreed among all Christians who truthfully hold the Catholic faith that we are subject to the death of the body, not by the law of nature, by which God ordained no death for man, but by his righteous infliction on account of sin. Just as Augustine had argued that sin had created sexual desire, so he also believed that sin had created death. Death, in the eyes of the Orthodox, was to be conquered. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians, "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death." Saint Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, describes how the apostles despised death and were found to rise above death. Christian faith is believed to imbue one with power over death, the arrogance. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, "But they which shall be accounted worthy to obtain that world and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, neither can they die any more, for they are equal unto angels, and are the children of God, being the children of the resurrection. Instead of accepting death as a natural part of the life cycle, Orthodox Christians use death as a tool to evoke fear in people. The 4th century, Saint Pachomius advised his monks, "Above all, let us always keep our last day before our eyes, and let us always fear everlasting torment." Very motivating. Gee. Saint Benedict's rule instructs: dread the day of judgment, fear hell, desire eternal life with entirely spiritual ardor, keep the possibility of death ever before your eyes. The ancient concept of an underworld, where one would go after death for rest and rejuvenation, became the frightening Christian idea of hell, a place filled with fire and brimstone where one endures eternal pain and agony. Death, particularly in a context where there is but one life and one chance to do the right thing, became a terrifying prospect. It took the Church a long time, however, to teach such an orthodox understanding of death. More like brainwashing. The Church initially made Christianity comprehensible to the populace by incorporating pre-Christian ideas. The concept of purgatory adopted by the medieval Church mitigated the harshness of Orthodox ideology. Instead of being sent directly to heaven or hell after death, one's soul could go to purgatory, an intermediate place, to do penance and be punished for sins before hopefully being allowed into heaven. Such a concept also proved quite lucrative for the Church. By maintaining that it could influence the destiny of these souls, the Church collected a good deal of medieval society's money for its services on behalf of those in purgatory. With the spread of Orthodox Christianity during the Reformation, however, all activities that dealt with death as a natural part of life were to be isolated and reviled. No longer should one think of departed ones as being in purgatory. People would be judged immediately upon dying and sent directly to heaven or hell. A person's death should no longer be made into an important occasion or seen as part of a natural cycle. Funerals went from being large community events to small family affairs. Orthodox Christians tried to ban the tolling of church bells at funerals and the use of special mourning garments. Cemeteries, once busy meeting places, would be segregated from everybody's life. Dancing, games, and commercial activities in cemeteries were routinely forbidden. A 1701 city ordinance in New England prohibited making coffins, digging graves, or holding funerals on the Sabbath as acts that profaned the holy day. Ironically, in attempting to conquer death and isolate it from life, Orthodox Christianity fostered a preoccupation with death. Augustine perceived life to be wholly overshadowed by death. For no sooner do we begin to live in this dying body than we begin to move ceaselessly towards death. Death, according to the Orthodox, could bring salvation. Augustine wrote, "But now, by the greater and more admirable grace of the Saviour, the punishment of sin is turned to the service of righteousness. For then it was proclaimed to man, If thou sinnest, thou shalt die. Now it is said to the martyr, Die, that thou sin not. Then it was said, If ye transgress the commandments, ye shall die. Now it is said, If ye decline death, ye transgress the commandments. Orthodox Christians, in their effort to conquer it, often ended up glorifying death. Jesus' most valuable act was understood to be not his miracles of healing or his message of love and peace, but rather his act of dying. The Bible states that the day of death is better than the day of one's birth. It became customary to call a martyr's day of death his or her birthday. Augustine tried to explain why death had taken on such an elevated character. Not that death, which was before an evil, has become good, but only that God has granted to faith this grace, that death, which is admitted opposite to life, should become the instrument by which life is reached. What an oxymoron. Saint John Symmachus of the 7th century wrote, Just as bread is the most necessary of all foods, no, it's not, it's meat and fat, animal fat, not bread. So meditation on death is the most important of all actions. And the prominent St. John Chrysostom declared that the principal character of a Christian is to desire and love death. What a death cult! Orthodox Christianity had taken on the character of a death cult, yeah, just saying. A preoccupation with death overshadowed Christian attitudes towards the world at large. Understanding earthly physical life to be inimical to spirituality fostered a zealous anticipation of the end of the world. Christians expected God to revisit the earth in the second coming to usher in the end times. In the canonized Gospel of Matthew, Jesus gives the impression that such an end may be short at hand. Truly, I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Periodic waves of expecting the destruction of the world marked Christian history. Yeah, they were very, very busy to do so themselves. During the Reformation in England, for example, 80 books were published on the subject of the world's end. Yeah, then you don't need to take care of Mother Nature. You just take, and destroy. God damn it. Orthodox Christianity changed the way people think about the earth and the natural environment. When God is believed to reign from above, nature is understood to be distant from, if not devoid of God's presence. Completely turned on its head. Such a worldview led to dramatic changes in the meaning of holidays, the character of those holidays and the perception of time, all of which were alienated from the Earth's seasonal cycles, the facets of human life, which speak of a connection to cycles, such as birth, sex, and death, were disparaged. Rather than appreciating the natural life cycle, Orthodox Christians denied that cycle entirely and became preoccupied with death. Wow.